Hey guys, Dr. Sitzel here. So in this video, we're going to go over cost and profit. But really what this is really about the firm. So when I say the firm, we mean like an individual business and how it goes about making decisions. We're going to explore 4 aspects of how the firm interacts with markets and customers. We're going to do that via price, then quantity, then talk about profitability, and finally that'll build up to entry and exit. So these things are going to sort of build on each other, and this will be what we call firm behavior. Firm behavior. Okay, so first thing, we want to sort of set the scene here for where the firm is at. And what I mean by that is that the firm is competing. So the firm is in competition. What's the nature of this competition? Well, the first thing is that it's going to produce what we call a homogeneous product. So it's producing similar things to what others are producing. The more different it is that a firm produces of a product, the more sort of market power that they're going to end up having. So here, the examples I'm going to work through today, later on in this class, we'll get into situations where the competition is fundamentally different. Here, what I'm talking about is we're all producing all the firms are producing a similar product, and what this is going to give us is highly elastic demand, right? Because this means that the products are close substitutes for each other. So highly or even perfect elastic demand, perfectly elastic demand. And you'll see that here in just a moment. Second thing that we're going to say is that there are many buyers and sellers, right? So there's lots of people that are wanting to buy this good, lots of different people, and there's lots of people that are in there producing the good, making it available and going about competing with the individuals. This gives us, the individual firms. This gives us an idea known as price taking. It means you don't end up changing the price by what it is that you're doing. The market dictates the price to you. Okay, so no price power. So by price power, I just mean if you set a price that's different than what the prevailing market price is, you're going to end up not selling any goods. Okay, and then finally, and this is an idea that I've not seen added before, so I want to give credit. This is from Cowan and Tabarrok that we've been using their textbook in places throughout this class. Highly recommend their work at all times. There's also many potential sellers, and this turns out to be really important, and I'm going to circle back around when we get to monopoly. Because in a monopoly, right, we have one seller, but there are also actually potential sellers. It's going to be a big idea we're going to get to when we get to monopoly. Also important in monopoly. So many potential sellers, it means people could sort of pounce on an opportunity if there's extra normal profits. If there's a lot of money being made, it will draw people into the market. So there's a big difference between a market where there's buyers and sellers in it, but few sellers potentially poised to pounce. Of course, in the modern situation that you and I would observe, it's almost always the case that there are many potential sellers. There are lots of people that can sort of pounce on the market. Okay, so here's our setting that we're accustomed to here. We've got supply, we've got demand. There's a prevailing price and quantity. All of us have seen this before, but the important part is that price then translates into the firm, right? So this is the market, this is the firm. That price then becomes the demand curve for the individual firm, and in fact, this will end up being both the marginal and average revenue. This is where the price is coming from for the firm. So what is this idea about? Well, it's really all of these things. So why did I say highly elastic demand? Because this demand curve is exactly flat. Why did I say that there's no price power, that we're price taking? That's because if we make a choice as a firm and we say we want to set the price somewhere above the demand curve, the quantity that we will sell will be 0 because there's perfectly elastic demand in this case. If we set a quantity below, all of our goods will be purchased up, but we could have sold all those goods at a higher price, so we end up setting that price sort of anywhere along here, and we'll go through and establish how we make that decision where we set the quantity next. But just remember what we're getting here. The firm is in competition, and so it faces lots of potential substitutes, lots of actual and potential substitutes for its good. We don't have a lot of price power, and there are people that can pounce if there's a lot of profitability in this particular industry. Okay, so how do we go about setting that quantity? Well, that comes down to an idea called profitability. Everyone's familiar with profit. I'm going to define it officially here. This is profit, which I'm going to use this little pi symbol, is the total revenue less the cost. So the revenue that we get minus the cost. Anybody who's had an accounting class or really thought about anything business related immediately recognizes these ideas. But let's do a couple of things here. First, total revenue is price times quantity. Right? So how much did you sell and what price did you sell it at? In the setting that we did, so from this idea here, right, we can sell as much as we want all at the same price. So when we add more goods, it doesn't lower the price that we're able to get. So that makes total revenue very easy to deal with in this case. The other idea is total cost. So total cost is just the cost of producing a given quantity. So when we pick out a quantity to produce, we add up the cost of making all the units that reach that quantity, and that's how we get total cost. But of course, cost is quite a bit more complex than that, and that's for several reasons. The first is that we have kind of two different types of cost. One is explicit cost, and it's almost certain that when you think of cost, this is what you think of. Your default setting is what we in accounting we would call an outlay. That means we actually took money out of our wallet and we put it down and we got the input that we're paying for. That's an outlay. So money went out. But of course, there's also implicit cost, which is the opportunities that are foregone by making a set of choices that we made. Okay, so this would be an idea you would immediately recognize as opportunity cost. But this is really important in decision making. I like the example that Cowan and Tabarrok use in their textbook. They say, so suppose that we have a situation, and we have Alex and we have Tyler, and Alex goes and borrows some money in order to get an oil well made on his property, right? And he pays $10,000 a month in sort of his total explicit outlay cost, and he gets $15,000 back in that month. So he's making a revenue of $15,000 and his costs are $10,000. So then his profitability is $5,000. And then it says, well, okay, and then Tyler, instead of taking out this loan, he just takes money that that's from his inheritance, right? So he's been given some money that's an inheritance, and then he buys the oil well, and then he just gets the revenue. Well, is his cost zero? Well, in some sense, his monthly cost is zero, right? Because he isn't putting any outlay in a particular month, right? But you guys would be quick to observe it's not costless, right? Because he paid this up front, and that money could be doing something else, right? It could be in an investment. So he could be getting his, say that the math works out the same, right? Say that he's got a return on that would have been $10,000 a month, but now he's making $15,000 a month. Then Tyler is making the same that Alex is making. They go on to point out a good way to think about this. This highlights what we call economic profit and accounting profit. So economic profit is your total revenue less your implicit cost. That is your total outlay plus your opportunity cost. So a good way to think about this would be implicit cost would be like explicit cost plus opportunity cost. Explicit plus opportunity cost. And accounting profit, so when almost everybody says profit, what they mean is how much did you make in your revenues over your costs, as if we were looking at your accounting books. And of course, we've already covered a bunch of things about how to think about cost already in this class and the value of foregone alternatives, and so we have a much richer idea in this class. I don't want to say that there's anything invalid about accounting profit. It's just a much lower dimensional analysis. Okay, but let's highlight that with an example. Suppose Alex and Tyler are going through and they're buying these, they've purchased these wells, right? But instead of making $15,000 a month, then they're only making $6,000, right? So and the good example would be the price of oil changed between the first time I mentioned this example and this time, right? So now Alex, of course, is paying $10,000 a month to run this well, and he's making $6,000. What's he gonna do? He's immediately gonna get out, right? He's gonna sell it off. He's gonna try to get out from under this particular ship because he's losing money every month. He's losing that $4,000 a month. The problem is Tyler, if he's not thinking carefully, doesn't have the same kind of problem, right? He's already paid the $200,000, and so is he really losing money? He thinks, okay, well, I'm just getting $6,000 a month instead of when I was getting $15,000. But if he could have taken that money and he could have put it somewhere else and gotten $10,000 a month, then he is also losing $4,000 a month in economic profit, but his accounting profit looks like $6,000, right? Whereas Alex's accounting profit looks like negative $4,000, where both of them have the same economic profit of negative $4,000. Okay, so just a little quick example, and I hope that highlights the economic and accounting profit differences. Now, what I want to do here is then say, now we've set up profit, we've talked about cost. I want to make it very, very clear. Anytime basically in the rest of this class that I talk about cost and total cost, I'm saying opportunity cost. We're in an economics class. We're going to use economic profit. We're going to use the economic ideas related to cost. So the things that I'm writing down now are opportunity cost included. And that's going to be standard fare for any economics textbook. Now, total cost can be broken down into two component parts. One is fixed cost. So these are costs that do not vary with output. A good example of this is rent, or if you're not doing big manufacturing things, then your like electrical costs are going to be pretty similar because the building's going to be on, and if you make a lot or a little and the lights are on and the computers are running, you're still going to be paying that. Of course, in a industrial setting, the electricity usage would go way up if you're using big machines that are used more with output. So then that would be a variable cost. So variable costs are things that vary with output. So input component parts are always variable costs, right? So if I'm making shirts, then the cotton that I'm using to the cotton that I'm using to make the shirt, that's definitely a variable cost, because how much I need for 100 shirts and how much I need for 1,000 shirts are very different things, right? But the rent that I'm paying for the warehouse, if I can produce this within the same building, right, it wouldn't necessarily go up with output. So then that would make it a fixed cost. So fixed costs are things that don't vary with output. Variable costs are things that vary with output. Okay, so how is it then that a firm goes about maximizing profit? Well, we're going to introduce two new ideas here. One is marginal revenue. So this is the change in total revenue from selling an additional unit. So I sell another unit. Q is for quantity, right? So I produce something and I sold it. How much more revenue do I get from it? That's the marginal revenue. So if I sell one more good and that good that I sold was sold at a price of 5, the marginal revenue is 5 in that case. The other idea is marginal cost. So this is a change in the total cost from producing a unit. Every unit that I produce is going to add to my cost. So the change in quantity that I've produced and how much that ends up impacting my quantity. Okay, so the most important thing that we can learn here is that marginal revenue equal to marginal cost is going to give us max profit. And I'm going to work this out with a couple of numerical examples, but before I do that, I just want to convey this sort of straightforward idea, right? If the marginal revenue is much larger than the marginal cost, that means it's worth it to produce another unit. If the marginal cost is larger than the marginal revenue, that means the additional cost that we can we incur by making this unit is not offset by the amount of revenue that we get in exchange. Okay, so let's look at an example. So here we have a simple idea of a firm going and making goods. So quantity is the amount that it's producing and selling. I'm going to say the price is $50. So what's the total revenue? The total revenue is this quantity times the price gives us that total revenue. So if I make 2 goods and I sell them at 50, then I have $100 in total revenue. Okay, so the total cost curve here is a schedule that I've gone and produced here. So we would have fundamental theoretical reasons for that too. I'm not going to work all those out now. So I'm just saying this is the cost. So we have a fixed cost of $35, and then it cost us an additional $10 to go ahead and make that next unit. So when we make the first unit, we get $50 in revenue, and it cost us $45 to make it, so we get $5 in profit. All right, so obviously profit is just total revenue minus total costs. Now, the marginal revenue is always 50, right? Because I'm saying we can sell every single unit at the same price because we're in this competitive market and there are many buyers, and we don't end up affecting the price by producing more. All right, so the marginal revenue is just equal to the price, right? Okay, so now what's the marginal cost? The marginal cost was, well, when we were producing 0 and then we went up to producing 1, it cost us an additional $10. You can see that I've made a sort of nice, clean, straightforward marginal cost curve for us. Now, here I'm just highlighting the change in profitability when you go to the next unit, right? And so our when we were losing $35, then we went up to a profitability of 5. That gives us a change in profit of positive 40. Okay, so first thing that you can do really quickly is just look and see, and I've made a fairly simple numerical example. Where's the highest profit? It's obviously right there when we're making $65 in total profitability. So notice the total revenue keeps rising. So we don't maximize profitability by maximizing revenue because the costs go up faster than the revenue, right? So we're making a positive profit all in this range, anywhere between 1 and 8 units. We're making a positive profit, and so by going up, your costs can outpace your revenue, and then you can whittle away your total profitability. Right? So we don't always want to make more. We want to make the number of goods that maximize our profit. And that's done by equalizing the marginal revenue and the marginal cost. Why is that? Well, every time we sell a good, we're getting $50 in revenue for it. So one of the mistakes that we'll make if we're not thinking too carefully is we'll say, okay, well, look, here's the biggest difference between marginal revenue and marginal cost, but that's not what it is that we're trying to go for. What that means is the marginal revenue is very, very high and the marginal cost is low. That means we should produce that unit and we should keep going beyond that because the benefit that we're getting is much, much bigger than the cost. Right? So as long as the benefit is higher than the cost, notice that with all of these units here, we should go ahead and produce the next unit. We should go and produce the next unit. When we get to the point where these two things are the same, that means when I've produced that unit, I've exhausted all of the units for which the revenue is higher than the cost. When we go past that, that means if I want to produce the 6th unit, I get $50 in revenue out of it, but it costs me $60 to make. I don't want to do that. That lowers my profitability by $10, right? Okay, so now we have this idea. We can see several things pop out right away to us. There's our marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. There's our highest unit of profitability, so we want to produce 5 units. Now let's go ahead and visualize this. So here I'm saying that's our marginal cost. That's our marginal revenue. Notice that the marginal revenue is flat because we're getting it from the perfectly elastic demand curve in this case. That is sitting right around $50, right at $50 actually exactly. So marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost here. Marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost there. That's where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. And that gives us a quantity of 5 at a price of 50, and that's what it is that I've highlighted on the table. Okay, so what's the second table here? The second table is our total revenue. So now I'm doing this column instead of the marginal revenue column. And this other idea is our total cost. So you can see our total cost rises, and our total revenue also rises, but at a constant rate, where our total cost sort of has this quickly increasing cost curve, right? So where's the maximum profit? Well, in this case, we're dealing with the totals, right? So the maximum profit we can have is when total revenue is furthest above total cost. Where is that? That it looks like right about here, right? So we can see the greatest distance between the two is somewhere in that area. That's right around our quantity of 5 again, right? So our total revenue is in the ballpark of 250, and our total cost in the ballpark of 185. Okay, so what I've highlighted here is how we determine what is the profit maximizing quantity. How much do we produce, and what given the price that is prevailing in the market, such that we have maximized our profitability. Okay, so what I want to highlight next, I'm going to use the exact same table, but now I've added an idea called average cost. So marginal cost is used to determine what quantity it is that we pick out that maximizes profit. Okay, so let's point that out. So marginal revenue equal to marginal cost gives us a quantity that go ahead and maximize profit. So that's the big takeaway there. So the question is, how much profit is that? How much profit is that? Well, to get that idea, we want to explore average cost. Average cost, and I'm going to show you why. So here's our profit function. Profit is the total revenue equal to the total cost. Well, we can also calculate the profit per unit by dividing through by Q. So just simple math here. And I'm saying, now let's divide everything by quantity. And that's important because it gives us our profit per unit is, well, remember what our total revenue is. Our total revenue is price times quantity. So if we divide by quantity, like we're doing here, the outcome is going to be, this is the price minus the total cost divided by quantity. So that's cost per unit. That is our average cost. So another way to say this, let me highlight this over here really quickly, is profit is the price minus the average cost times the quantity. So the difference between the price and the cost, because the price is what's dictating our revenue to us, times the number of units that we sell. So it's a kind of intuitive version. So what I want to highlight really quickly then is, here is our profit maximizing outcome, and there we see our average cost. So our price in this case is 50. Our average cost is 37. So let's go ahead and do the math now. Our profit is what? 50 minus 37 times a quantity of 5. Another way to say that is 13 times 5. That works out to be 65. Notice that that matches with the table. So there's our profitability of $65. That's what we got here. Okay, so what then does this have to do with our graph? Here's our, the yellow doesn't work, pardon me. Here's our marginal cost. Here's our average total cost or average cost. There's our marginal revenue. So our intersection point then is, that's the unit that maximizes profitability. It happens at a price of 50 and a quantity of 5, right? At that point, what's our average cost? Our average cost is right at 37. Right at 37. So that's how we get, that's how it is that we deduce what the profit is at the profit maximizing level. At the profit maximizing level. Okay, so I want to then go back and say, how is it that we get marginal cost, right? Because we have this good working understanding of cost. We have this good working understanding of opportunity cost, total cost, everything, but we kind of snuck that marginal cost in. Marginal cost is related to your productivity. Marginal cost is related to your productivity. So our marginal productivity is how much it is that we produce for every unit of labor that we add. Well, really, it works for any unit of production, right? So we can do it for capital goods, we can do it for entrepreneurial goods, etc. The simplest way to think about it is in terms of labor. So for the time being, I'm going to simplify down into you add somebody who's working for you, how much more do they add to your total productivity? Okay, so a marginal product curve can take different types of shapes, but the simplest and sort of most common one is a curve that looks like this. And this has sort of three different categories. And so this category here, where we're rising, right? So every labor that I add adds more productivity than the last unit. So every worker that I add makes everybody more productive. That's what we call specialization. It's an idea we've already met, so I'm not going to beat you up with it here. But it's just this idea that as we add people, we divide the task, they can specialize, get better at what it is that they're doing. If I'm running a restaurant and I have one worker, then they have to cook the food, they have to clean, they have to act as the server and the cashier. If I add a second person, I won't have them equally do all four tasks. I might have one of them clean and cook, and the other run the cashier and be served. As I add a third one, fourth one, etc., we can divide up these individual tasks neater and neater such that they focus on that task and get better at it. In consequence, they get better and all the other employees get better, right? So every additional one adds to your productivity. This area right here is an idea called diminishing returns. Again, ideas that we've met before. So when we add laborers at some point, we sort of limit the amount of specialization that can happen in this particular firm and industry. And we see that by adding laborers, we end up in a scenario where they are adding productivity to me, but not at the rate that they were before. Every worker that I add has slightly lower and lower marginal productivity. The additional units that they add are still positive, but they're smaller than the previous ones. And then, of course, we have this area here where the marginal productivity is actually negative. So this is actually negative marginal productivity. So this would be having so many workers that they get in each other's way, or we introduce a scenario where there's something about the nature of the work that actually means when I have more workers, they're less productive. Okay, that translates exactly to our total product. So this just means we're going to add up all the marginal products for every labor it is that we use. So for those of you that have had calculus classes, right, the marginal productivity is the first derivative of the total product. Okay, so those same three categories exist here. So the specialization means that our total productivity not only increases, but it increases as an increasing rate. Our diminishing returns means we're still increasing, but we're slowing down in how much more we're producing for every unit of labor that we're adding. And then if we aren't careful and we end up in this marginal productivity range, that we actually see that our productivity can actually decrease. It can drop off. Okay, so what I'm saying then is that our marginal product can be written another way. So here I've just multiplied both sides by the change in labor. So the change in quantity is the marginal productivity times the labor. So the amount that each labor unit would produce times the number of labor units that we add will tell us what the change in quantity is. That's another way to say marginal productivity. So now let's rewrite, let's take this and inject it into the marginal cost idea. Our marginal cost is our change in total cost. How much did it cost us to produce another unit? Well, we now have a new term for this total cost idea. We can insert that marginal productivity times the number of units. Now, in this case, what I'm going to do in the denominator is change the amount of labor each time just by 1 because it's on the margin. We're just going to add 1 laborer. So I can reduce marginal cost now to the total cost, the changing cost divided by the marginal productivity. So marginal cost is a function of your marginal productivity. If your productivity, if the amount that you get in production by adding labor is very, very high, then your marginal cost to produce something is very, very low. When your marginal productivity begins to fall off, it becomes very expensive to produce more. So it's not an accident that this shape here is reflected in this shape here. Okay, so our total cost falls. Now think about the intuition here. If I want to produce more, what do? I need to add inputs. If we take the example of labor, I need to hire people. Hiring people increases my cost because I have to pay those people, otherwise they won't come work for me. How productive those people are determines how much more gets produced for the amount that it is that I ended up spending. So notice that marginal cost falls when we're in that specialization range. It's actually cheaper to produce at first because we're capturing that specialization. Now, this is the classic marginal cost curve shape. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, but just notice that marginal productivity could take lots of different shapes, and that would mean marginal cost can take lots of different shapes. So again, just sort of the same kind of idea. There's the marginal cost curve can sort of be split. Total cost does the same kind of thing. Where when marginal cost is falling, our total cost goes up, but it goes up sort of slowly. And when our marginal cost begins to rise, it means that our total cost is rising, and it keeps going up faster and faster and faster. Okay, so now I've sort of tied cost and productivity together. So once we've done that, now think about what we've done so far in this lesson. The firm behaves by seeing how it is that the market is, in this case, dictating prices to them, but in general, how it is that the market is reacting to price. And then they go and then they set their quantity based on their profit maximizing choice, which is a function of the way that marginal revenue interacts with their marginal cost, and then they can figure out what it is that their profitability is going to be. So the first thing that we want to observe is that maximum profitability can be negative. So just because I'm saying we're maximizing profit doesn't mean that that's a positive number. So what would happen if you said the best way that I can run this firm still gives me a negative profit? You would exit the market. You would want to leave. Okay, so before we turn to the shutdown decision, exit and shutdown, obviously, right? We want to introduce an idea called normal profit. Normal profit is that profit is equal to 0, but that's economic profit. So opportunity cost is still being covered. So if you think like an accountant, you don't understand this idea because you're saying, well, but if profit is 0, then there's no money for the person who's running the company to be taking for him or herself. They can't possibly stay in the market. Remember them saying normal profit can be greater than 0 in accounting terms, but then would be 0 in economic terms, because you'd have to account for the fact that they could be doing something else with their time and resources. And in fact, this is the most insightful part of economics, right, is this idea of the choices that lead us to a situation where we forego something. Okay, so what I want to do now is just analyze a couple of situations where we have some different prices. So what happens if we're at price 1? What happens if we're at price 1? Now at price 1, there's the marginal revenue. So remember, this is marginal revenue. So the market sets the price. I'm going to highlight this on the next panel, but just I want to keep this nice and clean as best we can because I'm going to be adding a bunch of curves here. In fact, let's let's keep this a little bit easier on the eyes and reduce the amount of contrast there. So if the marginal revenue looks like this, then the marginal cost, the profit maximizing choice looks like this, right? Which means that we would end up choosing this quantity. We would end up choosing this quantity, right? So at that quantity, what's the profitability? Well, the price is up here and the average cost, right? So we went along this curve and then we figure out what quantity intersects with that. That happens, that happens right here. So you can see that the price is much greater than the average cost. In fact, let's just write that down as a situation, right? So we'd have like situation 1, price greater than average cost, so our profit is positive. It's bigger than 0. Okay. So our next situation then would be, well, what happens if our profit looks like this? What happens if our profit looks like that? Now our point of intersection is here. So now I've carefully selected that, where that's kind of the intersection of the marginal cost coincides with when our price, we've got our second price, we get this marginal revenue situation. Now our marginal cost equal to our marginal revenue is there. And then this situation, then you can clearly see, that our price is equal to our average cost. So our profit is 0. Okay. Now what happens if we end up somewhere in here? Price 3. Pardon me. Marginal revenue looks something like that. Now we kind of have an interesting situation, right? Because our quantity is there. Our quantity is there. So that's our profit maximizing choice. But the problem is our average cost is all the way up here. So I'm not trying to draw that on the other marginal revenue line. I'm trying to draw that on the average total cost curve. So what does this mean? This is a situation where our price is less than our average cost, and so our profit ends up negative. Does this firm end up shutting down? Well, what's interesting about that is the answer is actually no. The answer is actually no, and it's for a sort of, call this like a puzzling reason, perhaps. I guess it's only counterintuitive at first. In this situation, what is happening? Well, I've introduced a new curve here called the average variable cost, AVC, average variable cost. So what's the difference then between the average total cost and the average variable cost? Somewhat obvious, right? It's the difference between those two is the fixed cost. So now a firm is going through and they have two different types of costs. One is their fixed cost. Those are the things that don't change with output. Average variable cost does change with output. Notice that I've done something intentional here. The gap here is really large and the gap here is getting small. So as we would draw these out, we would expect these two curves to kind of come together. Why is that? Because your average fixed cost falls over time. As you produce more goods, if you have a cost that doesn't change with the amount it is that you're producing, then it begins to go to 0, right? If you could produce infinite goods, then the average fixed cost, the fixed cost would still be positive, but the average fixed cost would get arbitrarily close to 0, right? So in this situation, then, what is the average variable cost? It's this. The average variable cost we can think of as like payment to our labor or these other input costs, right? So you can cover those input costs. You still have fixed cost even if you shut down. So that's the real kicker here. You still have fixed cost even if you shut down. I probably should have made some space for that, right? So fixed cost even if you shut down. So bear with me on that. How would we know this? Well, do you get out of rent if you go out of business? You probably don't, right? And so this distance here, the amount of revenue that we cover above our variable cost, above our variable cost cuts into our fixed costs. So it's better to stay open and lose a little bit of money instead of lose a bunch of money. Why? Because we'd still have to pay the rent. So suppose I can pay all my workers and I have $1,000 a month rent, and I can make $200 towards the rent. I still have to pay the $1,000 either way. If I stay open and I operate, then I only lose $800 a month because of the $1,000 rent. If I shut down, then I don't manage to make that $200. Now I lose $1,000 a month. Okay, so that brings us then to our shutdown situation. Okay, so at this fourth price here, we're down here at this intersection here. And I picked that one out because anything below this will get us the same type of outcome. So at this quantity, we're now producing just barely covering our average cost. So we're just as well shutting the doors because we're not covering any of our fixed costs. We're losing $1,000 a month anyway. Any way that this works out, right? So what this means is we sort of have an interesting situation. Everywhere above this point up there is the actual part of the marginal cost that a firm will operate at. Because if we go below that point, we're losing so much money, we're better off being out of business. So this is what's called the shutdown point. We should exit, right? So there's our shutdown point. Okay, so how then does the market act as a whole? Well, let's take a look at the first example. So the first thing that I want to show you is, now remember from all the way back, the second slide, we showed we've got supply and demand, and it gets a price, and that price comes over here and translates as our marginal revenue. So the equilibrium situation then is that marginal revenue comes across and intersects at the point where average total cost, marginal cost, and marginal revenue are all the same. That's because that's the normal profit situation. Now, it seems like that would be something that only would be occurring by happenstance, but it's not. And the reason it's not is what I'm going to show you down here in the second panel. Suppose that we're in this situation. We're at supply 1. Supply 1, the prevailing market price comes across and gives us a marginal revenue that looks like this, and the outcome is that at that marginal revenue, we have a positive profitability. That's what that means right there, right? Is that the difference between this point and this point is a positive number, so there's positive profit. Go all the way back to what we said about competition. There are sellers out there ready to pounce on this extra normal profit, the profit above what your opportunity cost is. So somebody in the market is making more than covering their opportunity cost. What that means is people will want to enter the market and produce and sell. They're taking that profit as a signal to come and produce more. So one of the things that happens a lot of times in society is we look at profit and we say that's a bad thing. There's something evil and wrong and bad there. But you got to remember, it serves a function to say people are valuing this good so much that people are making extra profit. Now, this only works in a situation where we have competition, but basically I would say the default is that a market in the setting that we have in modern economies, developed worlds, is, when I say developed worlds, right, I'm talking about developed countries. So this would be the U.S. and Europe and these kind of places. In other settings, we don't have the kind of conditions that lead to a country being developed. So these are what we call developing countries. So these would be countries that don't have the kind of first world economies that we see today. In that setting, what happens? Well, those people entering will increase supply, right? This is all the way back to when we were doing supply and demand in the first few weeks of the class. When supply increases because a bunch of potential sellers now jump into the market, that's going to have that effect of lowering the price, right? So this is all supply and demand 101, everything that we're comfortable with. That will keep happening until we reach this equilibrium point, and it gets us that intersection point there on this new marginal revenue curve that's been caused by people coming into the market. So this is an equilibrium setting. So what I drew here in panel A, and I said, well, there's this equilibrium and it gives us that situation there. It seems arbitrary maybe when you draw it that way, but we have to remember that that's based on if you're in a situation where the price is higher, right? If for whatever reason the price started at that situation, then that would entice people into the market. And of course, the logic works exactly in reverse. If the supply curve were really low and then we have a prevailing price down here, what would happen? People are losing money when they rent and their leases are up. They don't want to pay rent anymore. They'll get out of the market, and we'll see that supply would then slide backwards, right? So there's equilibrium forces. This is actually what underlies supply and demand to some extent, right? That pushes people in and out of the market as the profitability dictates. So this is our equilibrium situation right here. That's not a random outcome. That is the natural force of competition, which is to signal. I think sometimes we get hung up sort of on this profit equal to zero idea, but there's a much deeper idea here actually, right? Which is the market by these competitive forces signals whether we need more produced. Notice that in this situation, the quantity produced goes up, right? So if people are making profit, that means competitive forces tell the people that are potentially ready to go into this market, it's time for you to come into the market to produce more because people value what it is that's being produced, and we're producing too little of it. So that profitability that's happening here is signaling that we need to end up in a situation where there's more people being more total produce. Notice that this quantity goes up, but this quantity goes down. So the individual firm produces less, but the total amount in the market being produced ends up going up because more people enter the market. It offsets that slight reduction in production from any individual unit. So remember, this has a very grand, going back to those ideas that we've talked about all along in this class, mutually beneficial exchange ends up going up. So that profit signal is very important to attract competitors into the market. We see lots of good examples of this. I will talk about this a bunch when we get to the monopoly setting, but it happens in basically every market. When you see a large amount of profitability, one thing you can be sure of is that if there aren't policy reasons, if there aren't legal barriers to entry, that's going to attract people to come into that market. And remember, our nice complex understanding of competition means we don't just compete on price, right? So we're going to also benefit as consumers from a variety of options, from an improvement in the quality, from an improvement in the product itself as those people come and compete. So I've drawn this graph, right, and we're focused on prices and quantities, but remember that embedded in all of this are those ideas of competition that we introduced earlier in the class.